Hey class, we're trying something new today for our asynchronous lesson. We're going to do a recording and you will use a Google form to follow along while you watch this. So make sure you click the link that was below the link for this video in the class plan or the announcement or the email, wherever you access this. Make sure you click the link to open the Google form as well and fill out the answers as we go. So I'm going to switch this so you don't see my face, you see the slides. Our first slide is your favorite, the Bellamy activity. I even forgot the parentheses. The Bell activity, Bellamy activity. Who's your favorite character? It can be from a game, movie, book, TV show, poem, really anywhere. I just want to know about your favorite character. Write about them. Tell me why they're your favorite. It took me a long time to decide my favorite, and I'm not honestly still sure this is my favorite character, but it is one of my favorite characters. I'm a big fan of Shakespeare. I took every Shakespeare class available at my university, even the ones I wasn't required to take. And throughout several plays in Shakespeare's canon, there is a character called the Fool, who is ironically one of the wisest characters in most of the plays he's in, if not all of them. So I just enjoy his humor, and I enjoy that he makes other people look and seem ridiculous. There are other characters throughout literature who are allusions to this character, and so he's inspired other favorite characters, like there's one in the Way of Kings series by Brandon Sanderson, if you've seen that. So that is the character that I would write about if I were to write this paragraph. So tell me about your favorite character and why they are your favorite. Doesn't have to be super long. In fact, it might be harder to keep it short if you love them so much. But I just want to know about them. Make sure you write that in the Google form. And next, we're going to move on to our lesson for the day. We have building on the rhetorical devices we learned about yesterday, a lesson on a quilt of a country. We're looking at purpose and viewpoint. It's by Anna Quindlen, I think is how you say her last name. She's one of the newer authors we're studying. We've studied a lot of older pieces. We're jumping ahead here. This woman was born in Philadelphia in 1952, so she's still alive. She's a novelist, journalist, and editor. She's won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary, not something you would think to win a Pulitzer Prize for, but she did, in 1992 for her columns in the New York Times. She's written several novels, works of nonfiction, children's books, and she's published several of her columns. She dropped out of college for a while in her late teens to nurse her dying mother and care for her younger siblings. An experience that greatly affected her. So, as you can imagine, that is reflected in some of her writing. So, we're reading her piece, A Quilt of a Country, today, and we're going to look for symbols. Remember, we talked in class yesterday about symbols being abstract ideas represented by concrete objects. So, ask yourself, is a melting pot, a salad bowl, an eagle, a flag, what symbol would you choose? Think about how that symbol represents the United States. So there's a lot of symbols that represent the United States. What is the significance of September 11, 2001? I think you guys know this. You weren't alive back then. I was your age, actually. I was a 9th grader in high school. In case you need a recap, America was attacked by terrorists. Obviously, this is a terrible thing, but it was a specifically rare thing because the only other time in recorded history that this happened, that the United States was attacked, was December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Because our country is so large and we span from one coast to the other, it is very difficult for our enemies to attack us. And so it doesn't happen a whole lot except in terrorist situations like this, where we just don't see it coming for one reason or another. So it was a huge deal, obviously. Approximately 3,000 people were killed and more than 6,000 were injured. Hate crimes and harassments against Muslims, South Asians, and Sikhs were reported following the attacks. But President George Bush called, and others called for these Americans to be treated with respect. So people who were not associated with the terrorist attacks at all were harassed and mistreated because people associated them with the terrorist attacks unjustly. So keep that context in mind. It's important to know. And then how does history and culture shape this essay? It's really an essay more than a poem. She wrote it in response to the 9/11 attacks. So she makes a lot of cultural and historical allusions and discusses some abstract concepts. So to understand this text, you're going to need to explore how history and culture has influenced its themes. So stop and reread it if you need to. You can pause the video, use self-questioning strategies to check for understanding, and look up any allusions that you don't understand. I'll do my best to cover any that I don't think that you'll understand, but make sure you pause and go at your own pace. So take a minute to answer the question now on the Google form. What do you know about 9/11? Maybe it's something I just told you. Maybe it's something you already knew. Take a minute to reflect on it. So pause the recording and respond to that question on the Google form. Now that you've responded, in case you didn't know, these are quilts. This is what a quilt looks like, or one of the ways a quilt can look. Obviously, there's lots of different patterns you can use to create a quilt. But basically, the basic form of a quilt is your good old square quilt. So it's kind of a metaphor for the United States. If you look at a map like this and you see the various states, you could imagine them each as pieces of a quilt. So we're going to do a little quilt of a classroom thing here. Obviously, we're not physically or virtually in the classroom. We're asynchronously in the classroom. So instead of writing on the whiteboard, I'm going to have you write in the Google form. But I want you to tell me, obviously your name is at the top of the Google form, but tell me your heritage and maybe even a little bit about your name if it has to do with your heritage, and something about you, your favorite TV show or movie. I may put a link to an answer garden or something cool in the Google form so we can all see this, but at the very least answer in the Google form. And I will find a way to share the answers with each of you so we can see where all of our classmates are from. Put your name, but just put your first name. So like I put Mrs. Bellamy, my heritage is European, French, English, Scandinavian, a little bit of everywhere. I love the Harry Potter movies so much. I binge watch them at least every 6 months. And I guess my most recent hobby is gardening? I don't know. Now, moving on, I want you to think for a second. Do you feel like our nation is united or divided? And now I understand that this is a very subjective question, depending on who you ask and what situation we're referring to. But in many, many ways, we are a very deeply divided nation. There's a lot of ways where people come together for good, and we are united in those ways. But politically, we are divided. So think for a minute. There's not a right or wrong answer to this. But I want you to reflect and answer the question on the Google form. How do you feel the country is divided? Or if you don't, explain why you feel it is united. So pause the video and respond to the question. Remember, there's not a right answer. Okay, now that you've had a chance to respond to this on the Google form, here are some images that give you some symbolism of how our country could be divided. There are a lot of issues over which our country has become divided. No matter which side of the argument you're on, if you are on a side, you can't deny that there are arguments being had throughout the country at any given time. This is not necessarily new, but there are often new arguments that come up. So I have linked to the textbook in the Google form. Pull it up. But I also have the story written here. And we're going to read it together. So we have A Quilt of a Country. I say story. It's actually an essay. And I have some questions here along the side for you to use to ask yourself if you feel like you're stuck and not understanding it. Um, there's, it's easy to get lost in the words sometimes and think, oh my gosh, this is boring, or I don't know what she's trying to say. Asking questions is a good way to figure it out. These are color coded and they also are reflective, so they'll give you a chance to process the information. So here we go. A Quilt of a Country by Anna Quindlen. America is an improbable idea, a mongrel nation built of ever-changing, desperate parts. It is held together by a notion, the notion that all men are created equal, though everyone knows that most men consider themselves better than someone else. Of all the nations in the world, the United States was built in nobody's image, the historian Daniel Boorstin wrote. That's because it was built of bits and pieces that seem discordant, like the crazy quilts that have been one of the great folk art forms, velvet and calico and checks and brocades. Those are different kinds of fabrics. Out of many, one. That is the ideal. The reality is often quite different. A great nation striving constant, er, a great nation, national striving consisting frequently of failure. Many of the oft-told stories of the most pluralistic nation on earth are stories not of tolerance but of bigotry. Slavery and sweatshops, the burning of crosses, and the ostracism of the other. Children learn in social studies class and in the news of the lynching of blacks, the denial of rights to women, the murders of gay men. It is difficult to know how to convince them that this amounts to crown thy good with brotherhood, that amid all the failures, it is something particularly successful or spectacularly successful. Perhaps they understand it at this moment when an enormous tragedy, as it so often does, demands a time of reflection on enormous blessings. Which, side note, interjection here, we're kind of going through right now with this whole COVID situation. It is a time of tragedy in some ways and has offered the world a time of reflection, not just our country, but the world, right? So we can kind of relate to this piece on that scale. Anyway, back to the text. This is a nation founded on a conundrum, what Mario Cuomo has characterized as community added to individualism. These two are our defining ideals. They are also in constant conflict. Historians today bemoan the ascendancy of a kind of prideful apartheid in America, saying that the clinging to ethnicity and background and custom has undermined the concept of unity. These historians must have forgotten the past or have gilded it, or that means like to make it seem better than it was. The New York of my children is no more balkanized, probably less so than the Philadelphia of my father, in which Jewish boys would walk several blocks out of their way to avoid the Irish divide of Chester Avenue. I was the product of a mixed marriage across barely bridgeable lines, an Italian girl, an Irish boy. How quaint it seemed now, how incendiary then. The Brooklyn of Francie Nolan's famous tree, the Newark of which Portnoy complained, even the uninflicted wasp suburbs of Cheever's characters, they are ghettos, pure and simple. Do the Cambodians and the Mexicans in California coexist less easily today than did the Irish and Italians of Massachusetts a century ago? You know the answer. What is the point of this splintered whole? What is the point of a nation in which Arab cabbies chauffeur Jewish passengers through the streets of New York, and in which Jewish cabbies chauffeur Arab passengers too, and yet speak in theory of hatred one for the other? What is the point of a nation in which one part seems to be always on the verge of fisticuffs with another? Blacks and whites, gays and straights, left and right, Pole and Chinese, and Puerto Rican and Slovenian. Other countries with such divisions have in fact divided into new nations with new names, but not this one, impossibly interwoven even in its hostilities. Once these desperate parts were held together by a common enemy, by the fault lines of world wars, and the electrified fence of communism. With the end of the Cold War, there was the creeping concern that without a focus for hatred and distrust, a sense of national identity would evaporate, that the left side of the hyphen, African American, Mexican American, Irish American, would overwhelm the right. And slow growing domestic traumas like economic unrest and increasing crime seemed more likely to emphasize division than community. Today, the citizens of the United States have come together once more because of armed conflict and enemy attack. Terrorism has led to devastation and unity. Yet even in 1994, the overwhelming majority of those surveyed by the National Opinion Research Center agreed with this statement. The U.S. is a unique country that stands for something special in the world. One of the things that it stands for is this vexing notion that a great nation can consist entirely of refugees from other nations, that people of different, even warring religions and cultures can live, if not side by side, then on either side of the country's Chester avenues. Faced with its diversity, there is little point in trying to isolate anything remotely resembling a national character. But there are two strains of behavior that, however tenuously, abet the concept of unity. There is that Calvinist undercurrent in the American psyche that loves the difficult, the demanding, that sees mastering the impossible, whether it be prairie or subway, as a test of character, and so glories in the struggle of this fractured coalescing. And there is a grudging fairness among the citizens of the United States that eventually leads most to admit that no matter what the English-only advocates try to suggest, the new immigrants are not so different from our own parents and grandparents. Lionel Castillo, former director of the Immigration and Naturalization Service and himself the grandson of Mexican immigrants, once told the writer Sturge Turkle proudly, "The old neighborhood ma-pa stores are still around. They are not Italian or Jewish or Eastern European anymore. Ma and pa are now Korean, Vietnamese, Iraqi, Jordanian, Latin American. They live in the store. They work 7 days a week. Their kids are doing well in school. They're making it." Sound familiar? Tolerance is the word used most often when this kind of coexistence succeeds, but tolerance is a vanilla pudding word, standing for little more than the allowance of letting others live unremarked and unmolested. Pride seems excessive, given the American willingness to endlessly complain about them being whoever is new, different, unknown, or currently under suspicion, but patriotism is partly taking pride in this unlikely ability to throw all of us together in a country that across its length and breadth is as different as a dozen countries and still be able to call it by one name. When photographs of the faces of all those who died in the World Trade Center destruction are assembled in one place, it will be possible to trace in the skin color, in the shapes of the eyes and noses, in the texture of the hair, a map of the world. These are the representatives of a mongrel nation that somehow, at times like this, has one spirit. Like many improbable ideas, when it actually works, it's a wonder. So take a minute to think, what is the point here? What is she trying to say? There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. I just want to know how you interpret it. So pause for a minute and write your reflection in the Google form. We're going to take a look at the specific passage. I want you to ask yourself what you think the viewpoint is. And remember, viewpoint isn't first person or second person or third person. The viewpoint is the perspective from which the author is speaking. So their situation when they wrote it. One of the things that it stands for is this vexing notion that a great nation can consist entirely of refugees from other nations, that people of different, even warring religions and cultures can live, if not side by side, then on either side of the country's Chester avenues. Faced with this diversity, there is little point in trying to isolate anything remotely resembling a national character. But there are two strains of behavior that, however tenuously, abet the concerns of unity. So she uses antithesis to develop her viewpoint. She's showing two sides of the country, like not physically East Coast and West Coast necessarily, but she mentioned several times throughout the piece um, different groups of people who war against each other. When she was talking about the cabbies and the Jewish driver who drive around the, I want to say Arab driver, passenger, and how those communities can war against each other, but somehow still live in this country and still want the same things for the country, or at least want the country to exist, right? Um, and so she's bringing in that antithesis here to develop her viewpoint. She references Chester Avenue from when she was growing up, that people of one origin couldn't go into because they were at war with those who did live there. Not literally at war because they weren't separate countries, but they were separate origins and didn't get along. So she's showing how this exists throughout the history of our country, but somehow the country still works. So she starts off, out of one, many. That is the ideal. And she really brings the argument full circle. She uses these rhetorical devices to develop her central idea, and really bring it back full circle and bring her central idea into focus at the end. So she uses several rhetorical devices to develop this idea, but if you notice any in particular, point them out. She says, the reality is often quite different than out of one many, right? A great national striving consisting frequently of failure. That's a nice little paradox, right? Or at least antithesis. It is difficult to know how to convince them that this amounts to crown thy good with brotherhood. That's an allusion to a song you may know from Sea to Shining Sea, right? That amid all the failures is something spectacularly successful. Perhaps they understand that at this moment, when enormous tragedy, as it so often does, demands a time of reflection on enormous blessings. So she's got she's juxtaposing these two ideas. She's got some more antithesis going on here. And then in the end here, she says, these are the representatives of a mongrel nation that somehow, at times like this, has one spirit. Like many improbable ideas, when it actually works, it's a wonder. So a mongrel nation, that could be a metaphor. A mongrel is a dog that comes from various breeds and is most definitely not a purebred, right? So she's comparing the nation to a dog that comes from several different breeds, because we have so many different people from different origins in our country. And so that rhetorical device would be a metaphor. So reflect for a minute on how this really brings her point across and develops her central idea. If you're not sure what the central idea is, there could be a few, but I get the impression that her central idea is simply that she sort of states it at the end there, that our nation is full of contradictions and things that should make it not work. But when it does, it's a wonder. It's a wonderful thing. So if that is her central idea, how does she use this antithesis? How does she use this metaphor and several other rhetorical devices throughout to develop that idea? And that's it. As long as you've answered the questions on the exit ticket as best you can, you are done. There is a spot, as always, for you to ask me questions if you're confused about the lesson or want some help with something else related to the course, please make use of that. I do my best to check those within a day or two of class and respond via email, or I'll pull you into a breakout room in the next class period. But I always want to make sure that you are on track and you have the help that you need to succeed. So keep up the good work. Thanks for watching the recording, and I'll see you in live class.